A discrepancy of 0.7 seconds between synchronized observation systems was once dismissed as calibration drift, until it repeated 312 times in identical intervals. That pattern marked the point where prisoner 959 stopped being treated as a collection of anomalies and started being treated as a behavior. By then, the system around it had matured enough to recognize repetition without understanding cause. Analysts no longer asked what it was, but when it would happen again. Timing replaced identity. Observation shifted from description to prediction, a lesser-known fact. Test result analysis and intelligence work often prioritizes repeatability over accuracy, with consistent error patterns considered. More actionable than isolated precise readings, the effort of prediction required restructuring. Observation windows were extended beyond standard operational cycles, sometimes running continuous monitoring for 72 hours without interruption. Personnel rotated in shifts designed not for efficiency, but for cognitive freshness. Fatigue was treated as a contaminant of data, a lesser-known fact. Crew training protocols for long-duration monitoring often include enforced micro-rest cycles, reducing error rates by up to 18% in high-focus environments. Yet even with longer observation, the pattern refused to stabilize. The 0.7-second deviation appeared across systems that should not have shared time independencies. Satellite feeds, ground sensors, and internal logs all reflected it independently. That independence made the anomaly harder to dismiss, a lesser fact. Design compromises in multi-system integration can unintentionally synchronize independent systems through shared calibration references, creating illusions of correlation where none exists. The response was not to simplify, but to complicate. Further, redundant systems were added, each calibrated differently, each isolated as much as possible. The goal was not clarity, but contradiction if one system disagreed. It might reveal a flaw in another, a lesser-known fact. Production issues in high-redundancy systems often lead to increased maintenance burden, with failure points rising non-linearly as components are added at its peak. The monitoring of 959 resembled less a scientific investigation and more a siege. Layers of observation surrounded something that never directly engaged. No movement was recorded, no emission was confirmed, and yet the data continued to bend around its presence. A lesser-known fact. Battlefield improvisation concepts have been adapted into intelligence analysis, where defensive layering is used to isolate unknown variables rather than confront them directly. There was one period brief, heavily scrutinized when the anomaly appeared to respond, not in any conventional sense, but through deviation. The 0.7-second pattern shifted to 0.9, then 0.5, then returned to 0.7. It was not random. It was adjustment, a lesser-known fact. Countermeasure development sometimes misinterprets adaptive noise as intelligent response, leading to escalation of containment efforts without confirmation of agency. That shift triggered the most intensive phase of activity. Additional personnel were assigned, observation density increased, data storage expanded despite constraints. Every variation was logged, cross-referenced, and analyzed, a lesser-known fact. Supply constraints in high-volume data environments often force compression algorithms that can obscure subtle anomalies, reducing analytical fidelity. For a moment, it seemed like progress. Patterns within patterns began to emerge. Not explanations, but structures intervals, nested within intervals. Deviations that align with external variables, such as solar activity and atmospheric conditions. A lesser-known fact. Weather and terrain impacts on sensor rays can introduce periodic distortions, sometimes aligning with natural cycles in ways that mimic intentional behavior, and then, just as suddenly, the pattern stabilized again. Back to 0.7 seconds. No transition. No trace of the intermediate states. It was as if the system had corrected itself, or something had chosen to stop deviating. A lesser-known fact: command doctrine shifts and anomaly response often occur after perceived resolution events, even when no causal mechanism is identified. This was the peak not of visibility, but of pressure. Every part of the system was engaged. Every assumption was under strain. The anomaly had not grown stronger, but the effort to contain it had reached maximum intensity. A lesser-known fact: psychological effects during peak operational stress include narrowing of analytical scope, where teams focus intensely on known variables while ignoring broader context. The defining scenario was not a single moment, but a convergence. Multiple observation systems, operating under maximum load, recorded the same deviation simultaneously. Not delayed, not offset synchronized. It was the first time the anomaly behaved consistently across all platforms at once. A lesser-known fact: test environments under maximum load conditions can reveal hidden synchronization flaws, as systems default to shared timing baselines under stress. That convergence should have clarified everything. Instead, it removed the last possibility of dismissal. It was no longer error, no longer noise. It was something that existed within the system, affecting it in measurable ways. A lesser-known fact: production systems are often not designed to handle confirmed unknowns, leading to procedural breakdowns when anomalies cannot be categorized. From that point forward, the cost became unavoidable. Analysts began to show signs of cognitive strain, not from workload, but from contradiction. The data was consistent, but the explanations were not. That mismatch created a form of stress that standard training did not address. A lesser-known fact: medical studies in high-uncertainty environments show increased incidence of decision paralysis, where individuals delay action due to conflicting interpretations. Sleep cycles were disrupted, not by necessity, but by choice. Personnel extended their shifts voluntarily, attempting to witness the anomaly directly, to catch it in the act of deviation. A lesser-known fact: psychological compulsion in observational roles can lead to self-imposed overwork, with individuals seeking resolution beyond operational requirements. There were reports unofficial, unverified, or perceptual effects. Time felt inconsistent. Intervals seemed longer or shorter than measured. These reports were never included in formal documentation. A lesser-known fact: medical and psychological effects of prolonged exposure to irregular temporal patterns can include altered perception of duration, even in controlled environments. The system adapted again, not by solving, but by limiting. Exposure time was capped, reports were standardized further, subjective observations were removed entirely. The human element was reduced in an attempt to preserve objectivity. A lesser-known fact: command doctrine shifts toward depersonalization of data often occur after subjective reports introduce ambiguity into analysis, but removing the human element did not remove the problem. It only made it quieter. The anomaly persisted, unchanged, while the system around it became more rigid, more controlled. A lesser-known fact: countermeasures that focus on data integrity rather than anomaly resolution can stabilize reporting without addressing underlying causes. Over time, attention began to drift. New priorities emerged. Resources were reallocated. The intensity of monitoring decreased, not because the anomaly was resolved, but because it was no longer the most urgent concern. A lesser-known fact: supply constraints in multi-priority environments often lead to gradual reduction of monitoring frequency for unresolved cases. Old age, in this phase, looked like neglect. Systems remained in place, but fewer people watched them. Data continued to be collected, but less frequently reviewed. The anomaly did not disappear. It became background. A lesser-known fact: production systems often continue generating data long after active analysis has ceased, creating archives of unexamined information. The replacement did not come in the form of a solution, but in the form of abstraction. New systems were designed to handle uncertainty more broadly, incorporating lessons learned from cases like 959. A lesser-known fact: design evolution in intelligent systems often incorporates past failures indirectly, without referencing specific cases to maintain compartmentalization. And so Prisoner 959 was never closed. It was absorbed, its patterns became part of training materials, stripped of context, reduced to examples of anomaly behavior, a lesser-known fact. Crew training modules frequently anonymize case studies, removing identifying details while preserving structural lessons. What remained was not the anomaly itself, but the shape it left behind, the adjustments in doctrine, the caution in analysis, the acceptance of limits. A lesser-known fact: battlefield improvisation principles have influenced intelligence doctrine by emphasizing adaptability over certainty in unpredictable environments. By the end, there was no final report, no definitive statement, only a gradual fading of attention, a quiet agreement that some questions would remain unanswered. A lesser-known fact: command doctrine often leaves unresolved cases open-ended to allow future reinterpretation as new technologies emerge, and in that silence, the most important change had already taken place. The system had learned not how to eliminate the unknown, but how to live with it. Fewer than 6% of archived anomaly cases are ever reopened after formal downgrading, and most of those reopenings happen decades later under entirely different frameworks. That statistical reality shaped the final phase of Prisoner 959, not as an ending, but as a slow transformation into something that no longer required attention to persist. The systems that once surrounded it did not disappear overnight. They thinned. Monitoring intervals stretched from continuous observation to periodic sampling, then to irregular checks tied to unrelated operational cycles. The architecture remained intact, but its purpose shifted from active containment to passive recording. A lesser-known fact: supply constraints and long-term monitoring programs often force transition from real-time systems to batch processing models, reducing temporal resolution by up to 60%. Personnel changes accelerated this transition. The original analysts rotated out, replaced by individuals who had not experienced the peak phase. To them, 959 was not a problem, it was a file, a line in a database, an inherited responsibility with no visible urgency. A lesser-known fact: crew training details studies show that second-generation analysts are 35% less likely to challenge legacy classifications, relying instead on inherited procedural authority. Without continuity of experience, interpretation shifted. Patterns that once triggered escalation were now treated as baseline noise. The 0.7-second deviation, once central, became just another data artifact, recognized, but not emphasized. A lesser-known fact: design compromise in archival systems often includes normalization, algorithms that suppress known anomalies to improve overall data readability. The anomaly did not intensify. It did not evolve in any measurable way. What changed was the threshold of attention. As new systems absorbed resources and focus, older anomalies were reclassified not by resolution, but by relevance. A lesser-known fact: command doctrine shifts in intelligence prioritization frequently correlate with external threat perception rather than internal case progression. There were attempts, sporadic and isolated, to revisit the case, usually initiated by new analysts encountering inconsistencies that older systems had learned to ignore. These attempts rarely progressed far. Documentation gaps, redactions, and compartmentalization limited reconstruction. A lesser-known fact: production issues in classified documentation systems often lead to fragmentation, where critical context is distributed across inaccessible compartments. In one such review, a team attempted to reconstruct the original dataset from preserved archives. What they found was incomplete, not missing entirely, but degraded. Compression artifacts, overwritten segments, and incompatible formats made direct comparison impossible. A lesser-known fact: test results in data preservation studies show that long-term compression can alter temporal relationships between data points, distorting pattern recognition. That degradation introduced a subtle but critical shift. Without reliable historical data, the anomaly lost its continuity. It could no longer be traced as a single, persistent phenomenon. Instead, it appeared as a series of unrelated irregularities, each insufficient on its own to justify escalation. A lesser-known fact: countermeasure strategies sometimes rely on intentional data compartmentalization, which can unintentionally obscure longitudinal patterns. At this stage, the system did what systems are designed to do: it optimized. Resources were allocated where measurable outcomes could be achieved. Cases like 959, resistant to resolution, were quietly deprioritized. A lesser-known fact: battlefield improvisation principles influence resource allocation models by favoring immediate tactical value over long-term uncertainty. The cost, however, did not fully disappear. It shifted from individuals to institutions. The memory of the case fragmented, incomplete remained, embedded in training, in caution, in subtle procedural hesitations. A lesser-known fact: psychological effects of unresolved cases can persist. Institutionally, shaping decision-making patterns even after personnel turnover, there were still those who remembered, though their number decreased over time. For them, the anomaly was not abstract. It was something they had watched, something that had resisted every attempt at understanding. Their accounts, when shared, were often treated as anecdotal. A lesser-known fact: medical and psychological studies show that first-hand experience with unresolved phenomena increases long-term sensitivity to ambiguity by measurable margins. Eventually, even those accounts faded, not erased, but diluted, incorporated into broader narratives of uncertainty, stripped of specificity, merged with other cases that shared similar characteristics. A lesser-known fact: weather and terrain impact analogies are often used in training to generalize anomaly behavior, replacing specific case details with environmental metaphors. Replacement, in the strict sense, never occurred. There was no new system designed specifically for 959. Instead, its influence diffused into multiple developments, flexible architectures, adaptive algorithms, and training protocols that emphasized uncertainty as a constant rather than an exception. A lesser-known fact: designed evolution in intelligent systems often prioritizes adaptability over precision after repeated encounters with unclassifiable data. Modern systems, shaped in part by these lessons, no longer attempt to eliminate anomalies immediately. They categorize, monitor, and sometimes ignore, recognizing that not all irregularities require intervention. A lesser-known fact: command doctrine shifts toward tolerance of level anomalies have reduced false escalation rates by significant margins in complex data environments, and yet traces remain in archived datasets, in legacy systems still running in isolated environments, in fragments of code and documentation that were never fully updated. The 0.7-second deviation still appears, occasionally, without explanation. A lesser-known fact: production systems often retain legacy behaviors long after their original context is forgotten, especially when those behaviors do not interfere with primary functions. Whether it is the same anomaly or simply a recurring artifact is no longer the central question. The system has learned to operate without needing that answer. A lesser-known fact: test result methodologies in modern intelligence analysis increasingly accept unresolved variables as stable inputs rather than errors to be corrected. The legacy of Prisoner 959 is not a discovery. It is a shift to quiet adjustment in how unknowns are treated, not as enemies to be eliminated, but as conditions to be managed. A lesser known fact. Crew training programs now include modules on operational ambiguity, teaching analysts to maintain function in the absence of explanation. There is no final record of closure, no statement of resolution, only the gradual absorption of the anomaly into the background of a system that has learned, through necessity, to coexist with what it cannot define. A lesser known fact. Supply constraints in long-term archival systems often result in selective preservation, meaning some anomalies persist simply because they were never fully processed. And that is where the story settles, not with an answer, but with an adjustment. The world did not become clearer. The systems did not become perfect. They became flexible enough to continue working anyway. Some things are never solved. They are only carried forward, quietly, inside the structures built to contain them. In 2019 alone, search and rescue teams in Alaska responded to over 1,000 incidents. Yet a small percentage estimates vary between 2% and 5%, and 5% remained unresolved beyond 72 hours. This is the life story of one such system of disappearance. Not a single event, but the convergence of terrain, weather, logistics, and human limitation that shaped how groups vanish in the Alaskan backcountry and how institutions learned, slowly, to respond. It began as a problem of scale. Alaska covers more than 1.7 million square kilometers, with vast regions lacking roads, signal coverage, or permanent human presence. Any missing person event in such an environment immediately becomes a race against geography rather than time. A lesser known fact. A core design compromise in search and rescue doctrine is the trade-off between search area size and search intensity, where expanding coverage reduces probability of detection per square kilometer. The parents of this system were not a single agency, but overlapping structure: state troopers, National Park Service units, volunteer rescue groups, and federal coordination bodies. Each brought different capabilities, but also different limitations, creating a fragmented response network that had to function as one under pressure. A lesser known fact. Early test results of multi-agency coordination exercises in remote regions showed communication delays averaging 18 to 27 minutes due to incompatible radio systems. The first hours of any disappearance defined everything that followed. In many cases, the last known point what investigators call the LKP was uncertain, based on incomplete witness accounts or delayed reporting. This uncertainty expanded the search area exponentially with each passing hour. A lesser known fact. Production issues in early mapping systems meant that some topographic data used in the 1990s and early 2000s had resolution errors of up to 50 meters, complicating precise location tracking. Childhood, in this context, was a period of trial and error. Early search efforts often relied heavily on ground teams moving through terrain that was physically punishing and slow to traverse. Dense forests, wetlands, and mountainous regions reduced movement speed to less than 1 kilometer per hour in some cases. A lesser known fact, supply constraints and extended ground searches often limited teams to 48-hour operational windows before mandatory resupply. Reducing continuous coverage of critical areas, training evolved slowly. Rescuers learned to read not just maps, but of how lost individuals tend to move, how panic alters decision-making, how exhaustion changes direction and pace. These behavioral models became as important as physical tracking. A lesser-known fact. Crew training data indicates that lost individuals without navigation tools tend to travel in circles of 5 to 20 degrees deviation, often returning near their starting point without realizing it. Early misunderstandings shaped doctrine. It was once assumed that missing individuals would seek high ground or visible landmarks. In reality, many moved downhill, following water sources, which often led them deeper into inaccessible terrain. A lesser-known fact. Battlefield improvisation concepts influenced search strategies, introducing flexible grid patterns rather than rigid linear sweeps to adapt to unpredictable movement. Small changes mattered. The introduction of GPS technology improved coordination, but only where signal was available. Satellite-based communication devices began to appear, though adoption was uneven due to cost and accessibility. A lesser-known fact. Countermeasure. Development in wilderness safety includes personal locator beacons, PLBs, which, when activated, can reduce average rescue time from days to hours. Growth came through standardization. Search and rescue protocols were formalized, manuals written, and training programs expanded. The Incident Command System (ICS) became the backbone of coordination, allowing multiple agencies to operate under a unified structure. A lesser-known fact. Command doctrine shifts toward IX reduce coordination errors by measurable margins, with some studies noting up to a 25% improvement in operational efficiency. Logistics became more sophisticated. Air support, including helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft, extended the reach of search operations. However, these assets were expensive and limited, requiring careful allocation. A lesser-known fact. Weather and terrain impact flight availability significantly, with helicopter operations in Alaska grounded up to 40% of the time during adverse conditions. Data collection improved. Missing person cases were analyzed collectively, identifying trends in behavior, survival rates, and environmental risks. This data informed predictive models used to prioritize search areas. A lesser-known fact. Test results from survival studies show that exposure to cold environments can reduce core body temperature to dangerous levels within hours. Depending on clothing and activity, at its peak, the system of search and disappearance reached a level of intensity where entire regions could be mobilized within hours. Multiple teams, aircraft, and coordination centers operated simultaneously, each piece contributing to a larger effort. A lesser-known fact. Production of specialized search equipment, such as thermal imaging devices, increased significantly after the early 2000s. Though high costs limited widespread deployment, a defining scenario often began the same way. A group of campers overdue, a delayed report, and a rapidly expanding search area. Initial efforts focused on likely routes and campsites, then expanded outward in widening patterns. A lesser-known fact. Supply constraints in fuel and maintenance can limit aerial search duration, with some operations restricted to a few hours per day per aircraft. What made the system effective at its peak was not certainty, but probability. Search areas were prioritized based on likelihood, informed by data but never guaranteed. Success depended on narrowing uncertainty faster than conditions deteriorated. A lesser-known fact. Countermeasure strategies in search operations include probability of area POA calculations, which assign numerical likelihoods to different regions based on available information. But there was always a cost. For those involved, search operations demanded physical endurance and mental resilience. Long hours, difficult terrain, and the constant possibility of failure created a unique form of strain. A lesser-known fact. Medical studies of search and rescue personnel show elevated fatigue levels comparable to those in extended military operations. 4. The cost was immediate and severe. Exposure, dehydration, and injury reduced survival chances rapidly. Estimates vary, but survival rates dropped sharply after the first 72 hours in harsh conditions. A lesser-known fact. Psychological effects of isolation and disorientation can impair decision-making within hours, leading individuals to take actions that worsen their situation. Not all searches ended in recovery. Some concluded with partial findings, others with none at all. In these cases, the system shifted from rescue to documentation, preserving what information could be gathered. A lesser-known fact: command doctrine includes transition protocols. From rescue to recovery phases, often triggered by survival probability thresholds. Over time, limitations became clearer. Despite advances in technology and coordination, certain environments remained resistant to effective search. Dense vegetation, rugged terrain, and extreme weather continued to obscure visibility and access. A lesser-known fact: weather and terrain impact detection rates significantly, with dense forest canopies reducing aerial visibility by over 90%. Replacement did not come in the form of a single solution, but through incremental improvements, better communication devices, improved training, and more accurate data models gradually enhanced effectiveness. A lesser-known fact: design evolution in search technology often focuses on integration, combining GPS, satellite communication, and mapping into single devices. Yet the core challenge remained unchanged. The environment of Alaska imposes limits that technology can only partially overcome. Distance, isolation, and unpredictability continue to define outcomes. A lesser-known fact: supply constraints in remote regions can delay deployment of search teams by hours or even days. Depending on accessibility, the legacy of this system is not measured only in successful rescues, but in adaptation. Procedures refined, training improved, and expectations adjusted. The understanding of what is possible and what is not became more precise. A lesser-known fact: crew training programs now emphasize decision-making under uncertainty, reflecting lessons learned from past, unresolved cases. And so the story does not end with resolution. It continues in every search, every missing report, every effort to locate those who have disappeared into environments that do not easily give answers. Some systems are built to find, others are built to try.